She inspired the most famous handbag in the world. She became a French icon despite arriving in Paris, unable to speak a word of French. But behind the glamour, the music, and the legend was a woman carrying unimaginable heartbreak, a turbulent love affair, decades of hidden pain, and the devastating loss of her own daughter. This is the untold story of Jane Birkin. The girl who never thought she was beautiful. To understand how Jane Birkin became a legend, you first have to understand the little girl she was before the world knew her name. Long before Paris embraced her as one of its own, before the songs, the films, and the iconic handbag that would forever carry her surname, Jane was simply a shy girl growing up in Chelsea, London. From the outside, her childhood seemed almost enchanted. Her father was a decorated naval officer who had risked his life supporting the French resistance during World War II. Her mother was a celebrated actress moving effortlessly through London's artistic circles. Their home was filled with culture, creativity, and the kind of elegance most people only read about. Yet even the most beautiful childhoods can cast long shadows. Behind the privilege and sophistication, Jane carried a quiet insecurity that would follow her for decades. At boarding school, she was relentlessly mocked for her appearance. Too thin, too awkward, too boyish. While other girls seemed to fit effortlessly into the world's definition of beauty, Jane felt like she was standing outside the frame looking in. It's remarkable when you think about it. The woman who would one day become an international symbol of beauty spent much of her youth believing she wasn't beautiful at all. Those wounds rarely disappear. They simply grow older with us. Years later, Jane would admit that she began taking sleeping pills as a teenager, a habit that quietly remained part of her life for decades. Even then, there was already a gap between what people saw and what she felt, inside a gap that fame, success, and admiration would never completely close. But at 16, none of that future was visible yet. There was only a young girl watching her mother's life on stage and wondering if she belonged in that world herself. She couldn't know it then, but the search for that answer would soon lead her into a marriage, a heartbreak, and a decision that would change the course of her life forever. And it all began with a man much older than her, and a choice she would later call one of the biggest mistakes of her life. The marriage that broke before it began. Sometimes the decisions that change our lives don't feel historic in the moment. They feel ordinary, emotional, impulsive. For Jane Birkin, one of those decisions arrived when she was just 18 years old. In the mid-1960s, London was the center of a cultural revolution. Fashion was changing. Music was changing. The old world was fading, and a new one was being born. For a young actress searching for her place in that world, everything seemed possible. That was when she met John Barry. He wasn't just another musician. He was already famous, the brilliant composer behind the James Bond films, admired, successful, and nearly 13 years older than Jane. To a young woman still struggling with self-doubt, Barry appeared to possess everything she thought adulthood looked like: confidence, prestige, certainty. The romance moved quickly, perhaps too quickly. Her father tried to stop the marriage. He believed she was too young, too inexperienced. But youth rarely listens to warnings that only age can understand. The wedding went ahead. Soon after, their daughter, Kate, was born. From the outside, it looked like the beginning of a fairy tale. A rising actress, a celebrated husband, a beautiful child. But some stories collapse long before the audience notices the cracks. Behind closed doors, the marriage was unraveling. Barry was unfaithful. The betrayal cut deeper than heartbreak. it shattered trust. And for Jane, trust had always been everything. By the age of 21, she found herself standing in the ruins of a life she had barely begun building. Divorced, alone, holding a baby daughter in her arms. And perhaps most frightening of all, uncertain whether she had a future at all. Looking back, it feels like the end of one story. But in reality, it was the beginning of another. Because sometimes life removes every familiar path for a reason. Soon, a film offer would arrive from a country where Jane couldn't speak the language, knew almost no one, and had no real reason to go. France. A decision made partly out of desperation. A choice that would lead her to the greatest love of her life, and eventually some of its deepest heartbreak. Paris destiny and the man who changed everything. If Jane Birkin's first marriage felt like a door closing, France would become the window that opened. By 1968, she had little left to lose. A failed marriage, a young daughter to raise, a career drifting without direction. The glamorous promise of swinging London had faded into something far less romantic. At 21, Jane stood at a crossroads familiar to many people, but terrifying when you're living it, the moment when the life you imagined for yourself simply disappears. Then came an offer, a French film called Slogan. There was just one problem. Jane didn't speak French, not a word. Most actors would have walked away. The role was risky. The country was unfamiliar, the future uncertain. But desperation has a strange way of disguising itself as courage. So with baby Kate in her arms and little more than hope to guide her, Jane boarded a plane to Paris. She had no idea she was walking toward the defining relationship of her life. His name was Serge Gainsbourg. At 40 years old, Serge was already one of France's most controversial artists. He wasn't conventionally handsome. He smoked constantly, drank heavily, provoked people for sport. His genius was undeniable, but so was his reputation for arrogance. And when Jane first met him, she couldn't stand him. He barely acknowledged her existence. Cold, dismissive, uninterested. She later admitted that his behavior hurt her deeply. After everything she had already endured, the last thing she needed was another man making her feel invisible. But then something unexpected happened. One evening after filming, the cast gathered for dinner. Someone persuaded Serge to dance. What happened next was almost comical. The famously intimidating Serge Gainsbourg stumbled awkwardly across the floor, stepping on Jane's feet, embarrassed and uncertain. For the first time, she saw something hidden beneath the swagger. Vulnerability. The arrogance wasn't confidence. It was armor. And in that moment, the story changed. They danced. They talked. They stayed out until morning. Years later, Jane would describe it as one of the most romantic nights of her entire life. Neither of them could have known it then, but that single evening would reshape everything that followed. The music, the fame, the scandal, the passion, and eventually, the heartbreak. Because what began as a love story in Paris was about to become one of the most legendary and destructive relationships in modern cultural history. The song that shocked the world. What began as a romance in Paris was about to become something much bigger. Not just a love story, a scandal, a cultural earthquake, and a moment that would make Jane Birkin famous far beyond France. In 1969, Serge Gainsbourg walked into a recording studio with an idea that many considered reckless. The song was called Je t'aime, moi non plus. At first glance, it sounded like a love song, but it wasn't. It was intimate, provocative, unapologetically sensual in a way popular music had rarely dared to be before. Every breath, every pause, every whispered word felt almost too personal, as if listeners had accidentally wandered into a private moment they were never meant to hear. The reaction was immediate. Radio stations banned it. Governments condemned it. Religious leaders denounced it. The Vatican itself publicly criticized the recording, and naturally, the world couldn't stop listening. The controversy spread like wildfire across Europe. Record stores sold out. Newspapers debated whether it was art or obscenity. Millions of people who had never heard of Jane Birkin suddenly knew her name. Overnight, she became one of the most recognizable women on the continent. But fame often arrives carrying a hidden cost. Because while the world celebrated the fantasy, very few people saw the woman behind it. To audiences, Jane became the breathless voice in Serge Gainsbourg's masterpiece, the beautiful young Englishwoman orbiting a brilliant older genius. The muse, the symbol, the fantasy. But symbols can become prisons. The more famous the song became, the more difficult it became for people to see Jane as anything else. Her own talent, her growing career as an actress, her intelligence, her ambitions, all of it was overshadowed by an image she had never consciously created. And yet, despite everything, she loved him. Not the myth, not the scandal, not the headlines. She loved the vulnerable man she had discovered beneath the armor. The awkward dancer, the wounded romantic, the artist who seemed to need her as much as she needed him. For a while, that love was enough. But beneath the success, another story was already unfolding, one that fans couldn't see, one fueled by alcohol obsession and the slow transformation of a man who was becoming increasingly trapped by his own demons. The world was watching a fairy tale. Jane Birkin was living something far more complicated, and the price of that love was only beginning to reveal itself. 12 years of love and what they cost. For a while, it seemed as though Jane Birkin and Serge Gainsbourg had found a way to live outside the rules. Paris adored them. Photographers followed them. Artists wanted to be around them. Together, they became something larger than a couple. They became a symbol of an era, beautiful, rebellious, effortlessly glamorous. From the outside, their life looked like a dream. They spent their nights moving through the vibrant heart of Parisian culture, surrounded by musicians, filmmakers, and intellectuals. Their home became a gathering place for creativity and chaos. In 1971, they welcomed their daughter Charlotte, and for a moment, it appeared that Jane had finally found the family and stability she had once lost. But appearances can be deceptive. The truth is that some of the most celebrated love stories are also the most fragile. As the years passed, Serge's drinking grew worse. At first, it was simply part of his image, the rebellious artist with a cigarette in one hand and a glass in the other. People romanticized it. They mistook self-destruction for genius. But inside their home, the reality was very different. Alcohol slowly changed him. The tenderness that had drawn Jane to him became harder to find. His moods darkened. His behavior became unpredictable. Recording sessions that once felt collaborative turned into emotional battlefields. Friends began noticing the shift. So did Jane. The man who had once made her feel seen now increasingly wanted control. And perhaps the cruelest thing about toxic love is that it rarely destroys itself all at once. It happens gradually, one disappointment at a time, one argument at a time, one broken promise at a time, until one day you realize you're mourning someone who is still alive. By 1980, after 12 years together, Jane could no longer ignore what the relationship had become. She was only 33 years old, yet she had already given more than a decade of her life to a love that had transformed her, inspired her, and slowly wounded her. So she left. Not because she stopped loving him, but because sometimes love alone is not enough to save people from themselves. And that may have been the greatest tragedy of all. Because even after the relationship ended, neither of them would ever truly leave the other's life. Their romance was over. Their story was not. And in the years ahead, fate would continue binding them together in ways neither could have imagined. The woman beyond the muse. Most people assumed that when Jane Birkin left Serge Gainsbourg, she was leaving behind the most important chapter of her life. In reality, she was finally beginning one of her own. For more than a decade, the world had viewed her through Serge's eyes. She was the muse, the inspiration, the woman standing beside a genius. But after the breakup, something remarkable happened. Jane didn't disappear. She evolved. While many expected her career to fade without Gainsbourg at her side, she quietly proved that she had never belonged in anyone's shadow to begin with. Film after film, stage production after stage production, she built a reputation that was entirely her own. Directors admired her emotional honesty. Audiences connected with her vulnerability. There was something rare about Jane. She never seemed to be performing fame. She remained deeply human even as she became increasingly iconic. And yet, perhaps the most surprising part of the story was Serge himself. Despite everything that had happened, he never truly left her life. The romance was over. The connection wasn't. When Jane welcomed her third daughter Lou with filmmaker Jacques Doyon in 1982, Serge sent gifts for the baby. He became her godfather. He continued writing songs for Jane long after they had stopped being lovers. It's difficult to find a word for what they became. Friends doesn't quite fit. Family doesn't fully explain it. Ex-lovers feels far too small. They remain tied together by something deeper than romance, shared history, shared scars, and the understanding that some people permanently alter the landscape of your life. Meanwhile, Jane was becoming something France had never expected. An Englishwoman was slowly transforming into a national treasure. Her accent never disappeared. Her roots never changed. Yet somehow the country she had arrived in by accident had become home. And then during a routine flight from London to Paris, another unexpected moment of fate arrived. A spilled bag, a casual conversation, a simple sketch. At the time, it seemed insignificant. But that conversation would eventually create one of the most recognizable luxury items in human history. A handbag that would carry her name long after she was gone. The world knew Jane Birkin as an actress, as a singer, as Serge Gainsbourg's great love. Soon it would know her for something else entirely, something she never expected to become her most famous legacy. The bag, the legend and the ghost she never escaped. It began with something almost absurdly ordinary. Not a red carpet, not a movie premiere, not a hit song. A handbag. In 1983, during a flight from London to Paris, Jane Birkin found herself struggling with an overflowing carry-on. Papers spilled onto the floor. Personal belongings tumbled from her bag. It was the kind of frustrating moment every traveler experiences, and one that most people would forget within hours. But fate has a habit of hiding inside ordinary moments. Seated beside her was Jean-Louis Dumas, the chairman of Hermès. As they talked, Jane explained a problem she had encountered for years. She couldn't find a bag that was elegant enough for everyday life, yet practical enough for a working mother. Luxury bags looked beautiful, but they weren't designed for real life. So she did what creative people often do. She sketched an idea. Right there, on an airplane sickness bag. Neither of them could have known that this casual conversation would eventually create one of the most coveted luxury items ever made. The Birkin bag. Over time, it became more than an accessory. It became a status symbol, a cultural obsession, a product so exclusive that waiting lists stretched for years and resale prices reached astonishing levels. Ironically, the woman whose name defined luxury had never been particularly interested in luxury herself. That contradiction says a great deal about Jane Birkin. The world was increasingly fascinated by the image of her. But Jane remained fascinated by life itself, by art, by people, by causes larger than herself. Yet while her name was becoming immortal in fashion, another chapter of her life was moving toward a far darker ending. Because there was one person she could never completely leave behind. Serge Gainsbourg. Even after their separation, his presence lingered like a ghost at the edge of every important moment. Their lives remained intertwined in ways neither fame nor distance could erase. And while the world celebrated the rise of the Birkin legend, Serge was slowly losing a battle he had been fighting for years. A battle against alcohol, against excess, against himself. The love story that had once captivated Europe was approaching its final act, and this time there would be no second chance. The day the music stopped. For years, Serge Gainsbourg seemed indestructible. Doctors warned him. Friends worried about him. The people who loved him watched helplessly as cigarettes, alcohol, and excess slowly consumed the man beneath the legend. But Serge always appeared to survive, until he didn't. On March 2nd, 1991, the phone rang with the kind of news that instantly divides a life into two parts, before and after. Serge Gainsbourg was dead. He was 62 years old. A second heart attack had finally ended the battle his body had been losing for decades. For the public, it was the death of a cultural giant. For France, it felt like the end of an era. But for Jane Birkin, it was something far more personal. She hadn't simply lost an ex-lover. She had lost the man who had shaped the most transformative years of her life. The man who had seen her arrive in Paris as a frightened young woman with a broken heart and a child in her arms. The man who had written songs that seemed to understand parts of her she couldn't always explain herself. The man she had spent 12 turbulent years loving. And perhaps most painfully, the man she never completely stopped loving. That is what makes grief so complicated. It doesn't care whether a relationship lasted forever. It only cares whether the connection was real, and theirs had been undeniably real. In the years that followed, Jane refused to let Serge disappear into memory. She performed his songs in concert halls across Europe. She commissioned orchestral arrangements that transformed his music into something haunting and timeless. To audiences, it looked like tribute, but perhaps it was also conversation. A way of continuing to speak to someone who was no longer there. A way of keeping a piece of him alive. Yet life has a cruel tendency to remind us that no loss is ever the last one. As devastating as Serge's death was, an even darker chapter, Saul, was waiting just beyond the horizon. Because while Jane was learning how to live without the great love of her life, another person she loved was quietly fighting battles of her own. Her firstborn daughter, Kate. And the heartbreak that was coming would eclipse everything that had come before. The loss no mother can survive. If Serge's death left a scar, what came next would leave a wound that never truly healed. Kate Barry had always been part of Jane's story. She was there before Paris, before fame, before Serge. The little girl Jane carried in her arms, when her first marriage collapsed. The child who witnessed both the beauty and chaos of an extraordinary life. As she grew older, Kate built a successful career as a photographer, earning respect in her own right. Her work appeared in major publications, and from the outside her life seemed stable. But appearances can be deceiving. Like so many sensitive and creative souls, Kate battled struggles that were largely invisible to the world. Depression, addiction, quiet battles fought behind closed doors. Then came the night of December 11th, 2013. Kate fell from the window of her Paris apartment. She was only 46 years old. The circumstances were never fully understood publicly. The family chose privacy over explanation. What mattered was the devastating reality that remained. Jane Birkin's firstborn daughter was gone. No amount of fame prepares a parent for that moment. No success softens it. No wisdom explains it. There are losses that change your life, and then there are losses that change who you are. Friends noticed a shift in Jane after Kate's death. The warmth remained. The grace remained. But grief had moved in and made itself at home. Yet even in heartbreak, Jane did what she had always done. She turned pain into art. Because when words fail, sometimes music becomes the only language left. And from the darkest chapter of her life would emerge one of the most personal works she had ever created. A final attempt to speak to the people she loved, even those who were no longer there. Turning grief into music. After Kate's death, something inside Jane Birkin changed forever. Not publicly, not dramatically, but in the quiet spaces where grief lives. The truth about losing a child is that life continues, but it never returns to what it was before. The world keeps moving forward, while a part of you remains trapped in a moment you would give anything to undo. For years, Jane carried that weight. And then she did something she had always done when faced with pain she couldn't explain. She created. In 2020, nearly 7 years after Kate's death, Jane released an album unlike anything she had ever recorded before. Oh Pardon Tu Dormais was not designed to comfort listeners. It wasn't polished grief or poetic sadness. It was raw, honest, unprotected. Every song felt like a conversation with absence itself. The album explored loneliness, memory aging, and the unbearable silence left behind when someone you love is suddenly gone. Critics praised it as one of the finest works of her career. But listening closely, it felt like something else. A mother speaking into the darkness. A woman trying to make sense of a loss that makes no sense. Perhaps that was why the record resonated so deeply. It wasn't about celebrity. It wasn't about fame. It was about survival. Because by then, Jane had outlived the great love of her life. She had buried her eldest daughter. She had spent decades carrying heartbreak that never completely disappeared. Yet somehow, she kept creating. She kept showing up. She kept moving forward. But time was quietly preparing one final chapter. And unlike every challenge that had come before, this was a battle Jane could not outlive. For the first time, the story was no longer about the people she had lost. It was becoming about the woman the world was about to lose. The last goodbye, and what remains. By the early 2020s, Jane Birkin's body was beginning to surrender to battles she had quietly fought for years. A stroke in 2021 slowed her down. Leukemia, first diagnosed decades earlier, continued to weaken her. Concerts were canceled. Public appearances became rare. Yet even then, Jane remained what she had always been, an optimist looking toward tomorrow rather than dwelling on yesterday. Perhaps that was why her final years felt strangely beautiful. In 2021, her daughter Charlotte released Jane by Charlotte, a deeply personal documentary that explored the emotional distance between mother and daughter. It wasn't just a film. It was a reconciliation, a conversation decades in the making. Neither woman knew it at the time, but it would become one of their last shared gifts. Then in July 2023, after nearly 2 years of constant care, Jane made a simple request. She wanted one night alone, just one. The following morning, she was found peacefully at her Paris home. She was 76 years old. And just like that, one of France's most beloved icons was gone. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Jane Birkin is that her legacy cannot be reduced to the object that bears her name. The handbag survived. The fame survived. Yet those are only footnotes. What truly remains is a woman who transformed pain into art, heartbreak into music, and uncertainty into courage. A woman who crossed a channel without speaking the language and became part of a nation's soul. More than 70 films. More than 20 albums. 3 extraordinary daughters. Countless lives touched through activism, compassion, and creativity. The world remembers the Birkin bag. But the people who truly knew her remember something else. A rare warmth, a fearless honesty, and a life that proved even the deepest wounds can still create something beautiful. Perhaps that is the real legacy of Jane Birkin.